Something that I never really understood was that housing, who you date, jobs, clothing, they're actually markets, right? And when it comes to money, debt, saving, and investing, these are all things that happen within the economy and the choices we make in those markets. So I wanted to kind of break all those things apart. So all of this is happening under the umbrella of economics. What is an economy? Who wants to take this?
The economy is a collection of needs, wants, demands, and other people and organizations that are producing goods and services to meet those demands. So a supply side and a demand side that get together in a market.
So what is a market, Kaylie?
I think that's a great. Did you hear my whistle when you asked the question? That's a great answer to that question. Exactly that. There are needs that people want, basic needs that people have that need to be met, and then there are wants and desires. There are people who are producing those. It's not that the two people are separate. Like we have needs and desires. We're also producing that for other people and with our labor, and then together we make an attempt to meet all of those needs, wants, desires.
Greg?
And where those buyers and sellers meet in the marketplace sets the price.
And Shay, is this something that you talk with your clients?
I wouldn't say it's a conversation that we necessarily have. I would say it's more so on a personal level, what their finances look like, creating a plan, budgeting.
Their goals, I guess?
Financial goals, all of that kind of stuff, yeah.
Craig, can you explain to us what the free market is?
The notion of a free market is when you have buyers and sellers that are exchanging goods and services without any interference by other parties.
Can you give us an example?
So governments, for example, if we take the labor market, for example, right? To a large extent, you might view the labor market as being an open market because you have individuals that are willing to sell their time and effort to buyers in terms of being hired to and being employed. Now, they negotiate and they end up with whatever the market wage. Let's imagine the market wage was exceptionally low for a particular individual. Well, the government can say, you know what, we're going to put a minimum wage down. We're going to say you cannot hire a person for lower than this wage. Okay, well, once you've done that, you don't have really a completely free market because the market has a constraint on it. And you can sort of think of this as like a spectrum. Like it can run from, there's things where we have a completely free market, and then there's things where we don't have like virtually any market at all, right? And there's some spectrum in between because governments regulate markets. They set down conditions. In some cases, the government involvement is very little, and to the point of being negligible. In other cases, governments have huge influence. It's actually rare to have completely free markets.
Some might even say it's a fiction.
It's a fiction?
A constructive
Let's get into
fiction.
this.
It's a constructive fiction. It's sort of
It's a social construct.
It's an abstract that we look at to analyze what's going on in the economy. It's a sort of platonic, not so much an ideal, but a platonic notion of if things occurred in a completely free context, where would prices end up? But of course, it's never completely free. It's not just that government is involved, but also there may be suppliers or maybe a small number of people buying who exercise an abnormal amount of power in the market.
Can you give us an example?
So, in a number of industries, like telecoms in Canada, we only have 3 or maybe now 4 major telecom providers. That means our prices are typically much higher than in the rest of the world. That's because they have more power in that marketplace than consumers do to set that price. So that's not just taxes or government regulations. Sometimes it's the small number of participants mean that, the people facing them on the other side of that transaction are at a bit of a disadvantage.
So what role does supply and demand play in utopic free market.
Well, it's meant to reflect a situation where all the desires for goods and services are met by people supplying them at a price that either side of the transaction is happy. That they are putting enough resources in to create something and it's being met by a purchase price that rewards them for just that amount, and the people who are purchasing are paying just equal to the satisfaction they get from purchasing those things.
Kaylie?
Thinking about this idea of a free market that doesn't actually exist, there are lots of rules that we put in place either to create a market that is a little bit more free. For example, in the telco industry, we might try to make sure there are more providers, that would be part of the solution to bringing costs down. We could also put rules in place that would limit the profit that a company is allowed to make in a particular industry because it's providing now a product that is a basic life necessity. They just happen to be allowed to make a profit off of selling it. So government comes in and plays an important role on both sides of that coin. Making sure that we have enough businesses in a particular market that they can compete with each other and consumers have the ability to change suppliers so that our needs are met. And then also making sure that the rules are such that we're not taken advantage of. And that could be the case in all sorts of different markets. We could think about rent controls. Think about that a lot in Toronto right now. We do have rules in Ontario that limit the amount of the increase that a landlord is allowed to put on rent if the apartment was first rented out before 2018. I was reading about this morning. After 2018, those rent controls, if it went into the rental market after 2018, those rental controls don't exist. And because the supply is so low, we're seeing landlords able to increase the rent dramatically. You see rent evictions, all sorts of things in order to extract more money out of renters. And if we had different rules, then we would see rent stay
The
down.
advantage of markets, the advantage of an open market is that economics has demonstrated that they tend to be more efficient. So in other words, if you have scarce resources and the market, operates and where supply and demand intersect, like where buyers and sellers are, have a acceptable outcome, right? You are very the economy is very efficient. The problem with markets is that the outcome that the market generates might not be the outcome that society wants.
Like what?
If left to its own devices, the economy might generate enormously high levels of inequality. Right? It could be the case that high-income individuals reap, 90%, 95% of all the income, and whatever's left is divided amongst the rest.
We kind of
Your
see that
society-
now globally with the billionaires.
So
right?
your society, your society might look at that and say, you know what? That's not an acceptable outcome. And as a consequence, you start introducing regulations or restrictions on the market in order to achieve an alternative outcome. So if you think about Canada and the United States, through a whole variety of different policies, the government of Canada and the provinces lean against income inequality. You tax higher income individuals higher, there's transfers to low income individuals. So the labor market generates an outcome, right? And it might not be a perfectly open market, but the labor market generates an outcome, and then government comes in and introduces policies to change the distribution of that income to make it more equitable. And then if you compare that to, say, the United States, well, the US has much higher levels of inequality than Canada has. And I would argue part of the explanation is that Canadians would not accept the levels of inequality that we see in the United States. That would be from a societal point of view, Canadians wouldn't tolerate it, right? And so the market is very good. It's very efficient at allocating scarce resources to maximize production and output. but the outcome of the market might not be what society wants. And that's where you end up with a lot of debate about public policy.
Well, I wanted to follow up with that.
In part, the
Yeah.
policies that you may put into place to shape those markets to an intended outcome also have unintended consequences. If we look at the profit controls you might put into place to try to limit the power of, say, the telecom companies, perversely then that can also lead to a situation where you don't get more entrants into that market and you don't get more competition. Rent controls sound like a great idea in some circumstances, and they certainly are, but they may also limit the extent to which you get more rental supply in that market, more apartments being built or more houses being put into the rental pool.
When you talk about these unintended consequences, what political values would affect the decisions of governments in Canada? Craig mentioned that you wouldn't see, Canadians wouldn't accept the level of income inequality that we see in the United States.
Yeah, at the same time, I wonder if Europeans would accept the level of inequality that we've decided on here in Canada. There are many places that have made different choices to actually increase equality. And when I think about the word efficiency or something like efficiency, if we're only thinking about speed and matching, I don't think we're actually capturing the full efficiency that we need if most people in a society or an economy are then just like destitute or miserable or both. And you can be rich and miserable too, of course.
Is that possible? I want to find out. No, I'm just-
But then we actually don't have an efficient system. We just have one person at the top of a pile of money and the rest of us all just like sitting around very frustrated. So when we think about governments and the values that they bring, you can see the federal government over the last number of years has looked to increase investment in particular activities. All of a sudden in the last budget, they're starting to focus quite a bit more on climate change and how do we transition or transform our economy to make sure that we're producing goods that don't contribute to climate change. That's a value they decided that they have and are now introducing policies to promote that. Governments across the country, not all of them by any means, many need to catch up, have tied the minimum wage to the rate of inflation. So the minimum wage is always going up, meaning that people at the very least aren't falling even further behind. Whether or not the level of the minimum wage is set properly is a different question. But that's also a value that a government will go in with and then make those policy decisions. So they're saying people shouldn't be poor or live below the poverty line.
The important thing here, though, and the way your question was worded, it sort of sounded like, okay, well, how did the government make these decisions? Well, understand that job number one for politicians is to get elected, right? Each party basically presents to the electorate, if elected, these are the things that that my government would do, right? And then Canadians elect a government. The government then introduces its policies, right? And if they, to some extent, act on what they were promising Canadians during the election, that's also how it basically you transmit the values of the people, the culture, and the culture in society gets transmitted to government. Government implements the policies so that you end up with an outcome that
the people voted for.
That ultimately, has the support of the people, right? And if you don't like what one government is doing, well, they're going to come up for re-election, right? And if you've made them very unhappy, you're going to get kicked out of office. So it isn't. We often sort of characterize this as if it's like the government decides, right? Like I think that on the climate side of things, I do think that the federal government internally and the Liberal Party, embraced the notion of wanting to reduce the impact of climate change. But I also think that the Canadian public demanded it, right? That I don't think you probably were electable if you didn't have a plan as to how you were going to deal with climate change.
This leads us right into choices and why we make the choices that we make. And if sometimes these choices are really choices or we really don't have any other alternative. Shay, when we talk about scarcity, can you give us a description or a definition? What is scarcity?
I guess in the easiest way, like the lack of lack of something. When it comes to, I guess, finances and mindset, we could further that by saying lack of money, but also not thinking that we deserve abundance as well. I think there's like a tie-in with that.
How can scarcity impact the choices that we make?
If we think that we don't have enough, I think that impacts what we think we deserve in some ways. If there's, let's say, an opportunity to invest, even if it's a small amount, if we feel like we don't have enough, we won't invest, but we don't realize that investing will actually provide us with more. So I think that would be one example.
I often hear about the cost-benefit analysis that economists talk about. Is that an example, like when you weigh the pros and cons?
Well, economics is in some ways, as Craig mentioned earlier, a study of how you allocate scarce resources or how you create systems for scarce resources to be shared in an optimal way. Optimality here is a loaded notion. It's tied to particular values of a society. One society might value growth. Another society might value equality more strongly. So there's no fixed notion of what is an optimal economy. The cost-benefit analysis you might do then is weighing one set of actions or policies against those priorities for an economy, or for a society. So if one society is very devoted to growth over multiple periods, then that implies a cost-benefit analysis of the benefits for growth versus the costs for growth over a set of policies that is different than would be the case if you were trying to produce greater equality.
Well, something we've been hearing about a lot, obviously, is the housing market. And it kind of suggests as if we all have the choice of eventually being able to get on the housing ladder. When we're making choices about housing, should we rent or own? Are these really choices? Can we even make those choices, or are those choices already made for us?
I think choices are bound in most cases. We have a set of circumstances we get born into, familial circumstances, and those constraints in our choices keep either expanding or building over time based on decisions we make, based on things that happen to us. I think the question in some ways points to, as societal level, do we take the notion of economic rights as things that are part of citizenship or not? Some countries have institutionalized them into their constitutions. Others leave them at the level of policy discretion or choices over time. And I think, fundamentally, what your question points to is, do we think there is a right of citizenship to pursue education, to pursue good health, to pursue the things one wants to do with one's life? Or is that something that's contingent? I'd rather live in the society with the former, where those economic rights are real, but that isn't the case everywhere or for everyone.
Kaylie?
Yeah, I agree that choices are constrained all the time by what's happened in the housing market, the policies that are introduced at all three levels of government, by the amount of money your landlord was charging you, might be trying to charge you now. And then also, of course, by the amount of money your employer is paying you for your job and whether or not you have enough power to make sure you are paid what you are worth. And that's a piece of the puzzle we also need to be talking about, which goes back to the first or second episode when we were talking about pay transparency as an example of a way to increase the power you have to increase your income. And that's another indicator of how much choice you have in the housing market right now. I know a lot of people too who have been saving for a home for a long time, and every year they feel like they almost got there or they would have gotten there last year, but now they have to save so much more in order to get there this year. So that's something that potentially you made a choice 5 or 6 years ago to save in order to get into the housing market, and every year that choice is taken away from you because the changes in the market.
You asked about scarcity. Well, we can see that the challenge we're having in home affordability is related to scarcity, right? There's limited supply of homes available for sale relative to the market demand, and that's been part of what has driven prices up so much in recent years, making it less affordable for young people to get into the market. And so, and this is something policymakers have been struggling with, at the federal level, at provincial level, governments have been aware of this issue. There's been policy debate about, how do you increase the available supply such that, young homeowners can get into the market. One of the problems that governments often run into is that on the housing side, most of the levers they pull, most of the policies actually impact demand. Like they make it, cheaper to buy. Well, what that does is actually push up home prices. So for the people that are entering the market just as that new policy is brought into place that makes it more affordable, well, those individuals benefit, but then almost immediately the prices go up and the next group behind them is now facing the same challenge that houses are unaffordable. There is, though, I would highlight a cultural dimension to this, though.
What's that?
And that is that when we look at Canada, the UK, the United States, Australia, we have a very strong culture around home ownership, right? The sense that, you're successful. If you're successful, you own your own house. And make no mistake, real estate's been a great investment. It is interesting, though, when you look at some other cultures, like, for example, in France, the share of population that rent for their entire lives is actually much higher than it is in the English-speaking world. And being a renter for your entire life doesn't carry any stigmatism to it that sometimes gets carried here in Canada from the point of view of staying a renter, right? And when we talk about wealth accumulation, I mean, you can accumulate wealth through a whole variety of different ways. Real estate's one of them, but it doesn't actually have to be part of the mix, right? So in Canada, I think one of the factors that's contributing to some of the real estate discussion that we're having is that we sort of define like every young person should own their own house, right? Well, that's also a cultural decision, right? That we've decided that that's a measure of financial success. Whereas in some other cultures, homeownership isn't the only objective, right? So I personally think that, if we increase the supply adequately to meet the future population growth, then we would actually have more affordable houses in this country.
But again, that's a policy.
That's a policy.
Right.
That's partly a policy
Thing,
decision.
right? And Shay, when you're talking to your clients, do they feel as if they have a choice between owning or renting? How do you talk to them when they're trying to make those choices?
Right. I definitely agree with what you said about the cultural aspect. I've spoken to many people who are leaning towards home ownership and they're in no way financially ready, but it's a goal of theirs because they see people around them going that route, and they think that if they don't have a home by 30, that they're like less of a person. And I just think that there's so many factors that were and are in the way of people getting to be ready for home ownership. And I think that, for example, horrible spending and bad credit and things like that, because they didn't learn. And I understand ownership in general as something that we should strive for, but for to the detriment of if we're not ready to get into the market, there's other things that we can focus on. We can invest in other ways that are more affordable, and we shouldn't be measuring ourselves up to other people who are in a different position than us. But I definitely see people want to own a home, but it's more so because they see everybody else around them doing that, but they're not ready. And it's okay if you're not ready. We can help you get ready, but you should want to own a home because you want to own your home, a home for yourself, not because you see everybody else doing it.
We've spent a whole week with all of you, and I just want some more knowledge from each of you individually. So I just wanted to give you 30 seconds each to add any final remarks when we do talk about money and wealth and the economy. Kaylie, I'll start with you.
Two things. One, talk about money. It's okay. And if you're like struggling with money, like we talked about this, I think, in the first episode, the best thing to do is face it. And then also it increases the amount of power that you have in order to go ahead and do other things, whether it's ask for a raise so that you can meet your goals, whether it's save to go to school or do other things, that increases your power. So talk about money, make sure you do the things you need to do in order to get more, including just talking to your employer about it.
And Brett?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that we are all the economy. The economy isn't some abstract thing out there. Everything we do, every choice we make forms part of the economy. And in terms of our own personal economies, dovetailing from Kaylie's comments, you don't have to get everything right. Do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Get a few things right at a time and then keep progressing from there. Money is intimidating to talk about. Make it less intimidating by doing just a few things at a time.
And Shay?
Yep, I would definitely echo that. And also, starting where you are and acknowledging your reality. There's a lot of avoidance that happens in the personal finance world, and it's so important that you acknowledge where you are and admit, okay, maybe my spending isn't great, because the sooner you do that, the sooner you can actually find solutions. And also, comparison really is the thief of all joy. Like, I can't say stop comparing, because it's something that might take time for you to do, because we're in that society, I feel like. But your personal finances are your personal finances. It's personal. So just because your situation doesn't look like somebody else's, or your, the success that you see is for yourself is different than someone else's, it doesn't mean that you can't achieve the things you want to achieve, but you have to at least acknowledge where you are first.
And Craig, I'll let you have the last word.
I guess my last statement would be, everyone can do this. When it comes to managing your finances, managing your money, and making investments, everybody is capable of managing their finances. It's not rocket science. It does have its own language. It does have certain words that gets used. And you do need to do a little bit of research to figure out what those words are, but it is not complex. It sounds complex when people talk about the economy and they talk about markets and they talk about investing. It's very easy for people to say, it's too hard, I can't do this, I can't understand it. And in fact, it's actually not as complex as you think. But there is a lexicon. There are words that get used. And so once you have a basic understanding of some of those words, you can actually do an awful lot yourself.
Wow, I am so grateful that you all took time to help us understand this better. It's a masterclass in money. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Our guests all this week were
Shay Myers, licensed financial advisor and educator of Finance for the Culture. Craig Alexander, president of Alexander Economic Views. Brett House, professor of economics at Columbia Business School and fellow at the Public Policy Forum. And Kaylie Tiessen, economist and policy analyst at Unifor, one of the unions that represents some employees here at TVO.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.